I'm Stanley Heller. I'm an activist with the Middle East Crisis Committee and Promoting Enduring Peace up in Connecticut. Also host of the Struggle Video News. This panel is sponsored by RPM, Revive the Peace Movement Network. A number of groups and individuals have been working on this project quietly for a number of months. We only went public last month. We have a statement, which you have, and a website, rpm.world. We hope to be a poll of opinion that will help the left see the challenges and opportunities of 2016 to avoid the conventional, comfortable left cliches and to help unite broad sections of the anti-war movement. We started this effort because we see a movement that is fragmented, unable to mount mass marches or demonstrations, and frozen into thinking that the calendar still reads 2003. Whole sections seem to believe in dark conspiracies. Some see the U.S. and the West behind every war and upheaval, unable to realize that there are other powers out there that can also be imperialistic, cruel, or just plain stupid. Unable to grasp that uprisings can be complicated mixes of revolutionary and reactionary waves. Others have spent years telling Obama that they've got his back, ignoring all the signals that all he wanted was blind upfront support. Worldwide, we have a few problems. Openly racist strongmen winning elections in country after country, tens of millions fleeing devastation, religious-based fanatics of every stripe, climate catastrophe, the sixth mass extinction, and $1 trillion program to make nuclear war more possible. On the other hand, there's been the worldwide Occupy movement, Black Lives Matter, hundreds of thousands marching for a livable climate, the revolutions of 2011, and the unexpected outpouring of support by millions in this country for a self-proclaimed socialist and political revolutionary running for president. Unprecedented and terrifying challenges lead to great opportunities, and our panel will explore them today. So here's how our program will go. We'll have 4 talks that'll take up the first hour, and then questions and answers and short statements from you all in the second hour, hopefully with an emphasis on action and organizing. Our speakers, and I'll introduce them one by one, but I'll just name them now: Ashley Smith, Nidal Bitari, Dan Fisher, and Medea Benjamin. I first learned about Syria and the popular uprising and the Palestinian Syrians from Nidal Bitari, who's going to speak second, and I'll do that introduction a little later. We had a change in order here. I'm sorry. Ashley Smith is a member of the International Socialist Organization. I believe that's the largest group of socialist activists in this country. Certainly their socialism conferences with their rousing demonstrations and chanting bring excitement to the left. He's on the editorial board of the International Socialist Review. He writes frequently in many publications on imperialism. Most recently, he published a piece in the ISR entitled "The Asymmetric World Order." Ashley Smith.
Thanks, Stan. So I was thinking as I was getting ready for this talk that 13 years ago, we were all marching in New York City 500,000, 600,000, millions of people all around the world, the largest single day of anti-war activism in human history. And you can't imagine a more different scenario today when you look at the state of the anti-war movement. Back in 2003, the New York Times said there are two superpowers in the world today: the American state and international public opinion. It was always an exaggeration back then, and certainly it would be an exaggeration now, where we have a totally different scenario. It was an exaggeration because really to stop the drive to war would have required a general strike of workers and a soldiers' revolt, because the Bush administration, with the backing of most of the Democratic Party, was determined to go into the Middle East to seize control of the strategic energy reserves there in order to dominate potential rivals in the world system. So the need for an anti-war movement continues today, because that same project is still being exercised by the United States as well as other powers in the Middle East, and what people broadly construe as the Middle East, from Afghanistan all the way down into North Africa. That project is still going on, and we need an anti-war movement. But if you look at the anti-war organizations, they're in a state of disrepair. UFPJ, which was the largest anti-war organization coalition, dissolved into a network. Answer, which was in some ways its collaborator and rival, is seriously diminished as a force, and most local anti-war formations have become email lists. They are no longer active, organizing, protesting, demonstrating. And it's not because U.S. imperialism doesn't need to be protested today in the United States. Under Obama, he's done very similar things that Bush has done. You know, there's a united project between the two parties of American capitalism, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And so if you look at what Obama has done, he continued the occupation of Iraq, he escalated the intervention into Afghanistan, unleashed an unrelenting drone war all across the world, is deploying special forces and covert operations to Iraq in particular to take on ISIS, which in many ways is the fantasy enemy, is the perfect alibi for this continuing project of American imperial domination of the Middle East. But it's not only a drive to confront and attempt to control things in the Middle East. The U.S. under Obama is also conducting the pivot to Asia. Obama's about to be scurrying off to Asia to curry favor among various allies to confront, contain, and try and prevent the rise of China as a new imperial power in the world system. And Obama has also launched in what people like Mikhail Gorbachev call a new Cold War against Russia. That is, we're seeing scary inter-imperial dynamics develop in the world system. So we certainly need a vibrant anti-war movement, but we don't have one. And there are some things that have caused this situation that we don't control, that we can't really shift. One of them is that Obama has largely steered away from direct mass deployment of American troops on the ground, and instead has turned to drones and special forces. So the immediate impact of large troop deployments, which was one of the key forces that instigated and precipitated the anti-war movement against the Iraq war, has been taken away. So there's an indirect impact, but that indirect impact is massive. So like Bernie Sanders is talking about all sorts of important social reforms. If you wanted to pay for that, you could simply cut the military budget by a significant amount, and you could pay for all those domestic social reforms. So the lack of those domestic social reforms is tied to this expenditure of treasure on the continuing imperial project that the U.S. is conducting. So you have that situation where there's not a direct impingement on people's lives. The other thing, as I just referred to it, is that ISIS, which is really a bastard child of the American occupation of Iraq, that is an outgrowth of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which didn't exist in Iraq until the American intervention. So it's a bastard child of the American occupation of the country, is a perfect cover for the U.S. to continue its project in the Middle East. And given the state and ruling class induced paranoia about terrorism and Islam, it's a perfect cover for the continuing operation of the United States. So therefore, because of these conditions, there's relative passive support for the U.S. project, and there's very little mass opposition to it. So those factors we don't really control, but there are factors that we do control that I think have really impinged on the capacity of the anti-war movement. to protest, let alone revive itself in this context of an ongoing rapacious imperialism. And I think there are two explanations, two elements of the politics of the anti-war movement that have been an impediment for the core of the anti-war movement attempting to revive protest and struggle in opposition to the empire. And I think there's one wing of the anti-war movement which has a liberal political worldview that thinks the American state can be a force for good in the world, doesn't really question the war on terror as really an imperial project covered up in anti-terrorism rhetoric, and relies on the Democratic Party as a potential ally in the attempt to stop wars and American imperial projects. And I think both of those are fundamentally flawed ideas and have led to disastrous consequences for the anti-war movement. And I think that affected UFPJ in particular, which had been the predominant liberal anti-war coalition. And it came into being not to oppose the war on terror, but to oppose the Iraq war. So it actually kept the question of the war in Afghanistan off the table, which meant that political questioning of the war on terror was never really interrogated. And the assumption was that the American state was doing something good in Afghanistan. It was dealing with al-Qaeda, dealing with the Taliban, fighting jihadists, etc. And that, I would argue, is all a cover for American imperial assertion. They don't really oppose jihadist terrorism whatsoever. So UFPJ really came into being to oppose the Iraq war, which was a Republican-led war. Of course, as we know, endorsed by most of the leaders of the Democratic Party itself. But I think the politics of thinking the Democratic Party was somehow a challenge to Bush's war led UFPJ into political problems that undermine its capacity as a movement, beginning with the 2004 election. After we failed to stop the war before it started, with the 2004 election, many of the constituent elements of UFPJ actually backed John Kerry's campaign. Even though John Kerry had voted for the war, and at the Democratic Party National Convention, he went to the podium and saluted, saying he was there to serve his duty for the American empire. So I think this illusion that the Democratic Party was anti-war was explicitly refuted by Kerry himself, and led to a process of demobilization that I think really hit home in 2008 with the election of the supposed anti-war candidate Barack Obama, which, as I've said, he does not deserve the Nobel Prize. Or maybe he does deserve the Nobel Prize, given that Henry Kissinger was a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. It should be called the Nobel War Prize, in fact, not the Nobel Peace Prize. So really, with the election of Obama, UFPJ effectively folded. And at the last convention, there was a debate about which way forward for the anti-war movement. Those of us on the left wing of UFPJ said we've got to take up the Afghanistan war and oppose that because Obama's going to escalate it. Many of the leaders of UFPJ tried to fend off that attempt to get Afghanistan to be a central part so that you could have continuity of the anti-war movement. Instead, they fought it off and instead said we need to move into a multi-issue, not necessarily anti-war series of struggles. And that led to the effective dissolution of UFPJ. So that took the liberal anti-war forces off the table, and they were really the predominant ones. In that vacuum, those forces that attempted to continue the anti-war movement were of a mainly left-wing character and got expressed through the anti-war coalition answer, which was really a coalition that was tightly run and controlled by the Workers' World Party and their successor organization after a split in Workers' World called the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Now, to their credit, they opposed all of America's wars. But to their discredit, they took a position of actually supporting other imperial powers and their local dictatorial allies, which I think are fatal flaws in that approach of answer for reasons that I'll lay out. But I think one of their big weaknesses was that they thought you had to have a laundry list of positions on everything under the sun, which actually kept liberal anti-war forces at a distance from answer as a coalition, because we've got to have a united front method in which we agree to a minimum program of anti-war activism to get everybody in the table and then debate and discuss the kind of broader agenda for the left and the anti-imperialist movement. So I think that was a flaw. But I think the deeper argument about the flaws of Answer was that it had a politics that were shaped by a Stalinist worldview that workers' world possesses, which thought during the Cold War that Stalin's Russia, Mao's China were some form of socialist organization, and therefore they took a side in that Cold War supporting the anti-American camp, Russia, China, and their subsidiary allies throughout the world system. And that legacy has shaped its politics of Answer and the Party for Socialism and Liberation and workers' world today, a politics of campism. So the logic of it is my enemy's enemy is my friend. Tragically, my enemy's enemy is not necessarily my friend. It's a fundamentally flawed political position, which I think leads the anti-war movement into profound disrepute. And in the form of the current politics, it's not even supporting a supposed socialist camp. It's supporting openly capitalist powers like China, like Russia, and their subsidiary states who have no pretensions to being socialist, like Assad's regime in Syria, which is a proudly neoliberal capitalist regime that has nothing in common with the socialist tradition. So the logic of campism, the logic of my enemy's enemy is my friend, doesn't even need a socialist cover for its politics to work itself out. And I think this position has led to two disastrous consequences. Number one, it actually aligns the anti-war movement with the autocratic regimes that are oppressing millions of people in the Middle East. So Answer stood with the Egyptian revolution, but not the Syrian revolution. It didn't stand with the uprising of people trying to win democracy and liberation in Syria because it thought that Assad was in the anti-imperialist camp. So they aligned themselves with a brutal dictatorial regime and continue to do so and actually oppose building solidarity with the continuing struggle of the Syrian people for their emancipation from the Assad regime. That position alienates in a fundamental way the genuine revolutionaries that are trying to organize in the Middle East today in very, very difficult positions. It also has a negative impact domestically. We're not going to win a new generation of radicalizing people to sign up with an anti-war movement that supports dictators who are massacring their people. It will actually push them away from the anti-war movement and make them prey to liberal pro-imperialist arguments that the U.S. can somehow play a humanitarian role in the crises in the Middle East. So it not only has a disastrous implication in the Middle East, it has a domestic disastrous implications. So I'll just conclude by laying out what I think are going to be the key elements for an actual process of reviving the anti-war movement today. And really they're principles, because we can't snap our fingers and suddenly induce an anti-war movement to come into being for the objective reasons that we don't control that I described earlier. Number one, we have to be independent from both capitalist parties in the United States. Both the Democratic Party, which has blood in its hands for the whole 20th century. It started most of the American wars and occupations of the 20th century. It is not an alternative to the Republican Party, as I think the Obama administration has proved beyond a shadow of a doubt. We should also have no illusions in the capacity of the American state to deliver liberation anywhere in the world for any oppressed people. Martin Luther King got it right in the 1960s when he described the American state as the greatest purveyor of violence in our world today. So you can't expect a shark to become a vegetarian. It's not going to suddenly decide that it's going to have a different dietary habit. It's a shark, and we should understand it as such. That means we have to oppose American imperialism in all its guises, whether it's war, whether it's sanctions, whether it's indirect manipulations of subsidiary forces all around the world. That is, the slogan is correct. The main enemy of the people in the world is the U.S. state, and it's the main enemy of people in the United States as well. When you think about the diversion of nearly 50% of the American federal budget into war-making in the world system. But, and there's another important principle, it's not the only enemy. We have a world system that's developing in which Russia is a rising potential power, and you're seeing its project in Syria, where it is along with the Assad regime carpet bombing people in city after city, the siege of Aleppo, the strangulation and massacres of scores and hundreds and thousands of people and their displacement. But it's not only Russia, China as well. So while we oppose the American imperial project, we also, if we're going to be principled anti-war activists, we have to oppose the imperial project of its contending powers, Russia and China. And instead of falling for the logic of campism, we should stand with the liberation struggle of people in the world, regardless of which camp they're in. So we stand with the Syrian revolution and the Egyptian revolution. We have to have both things if we're going to be principled in rebuilding the anti-war movement. And really, their liberation is bound up with our liberation. That is, by building international solidarity, we show that people in the Middle East and people in other sections of the world have allies that have their back in their struggle, and they will have our back in our struggle. And so it's really the ABCs of international solidarity. So these are, I think, the basic principles that we have to go through the process of rebuilding the anti-war movement. But as I said, it's not going to be a snap-your-fingers situation. We are going to have to argue this through against the liberal dead end, as well as this so-called anti-imperialist left dead end, which is actually pro-imperialist, pro-war left that's on the side of the counter-revolution. Both of those things have led the anti-war movement to a principled cul-de-sac. We need to start building a genuine alternative. That's what the Revive, the anti-war movement, is really all about.
Outstanding. Thank you, Ashley. Now I want to talk and introduce Nidal Bitari. I first learned about Syria, or the Syrian uprising, and the Palestinian Syrians from Nidal at a conference, a panel much like this down in Washington, I don't know, 2013 perhaps. You know, I've been working on Palestine for 30 years, and I knew there was Palestinians in Yarmouk, but I didn't know very much about it. And it was kind of jaw-dropping to hear from him what was going on, particularly in Yarmouk camp, where he was born. Nidal is a Syrian-Palestinian journalist from the refugee camp in Damascus called Yarmouk. He earned his bachelor's and master's degree in political sociology from Damascus University. He left Syria for Lebanon in December 2011, then came to the United States in April 2013. He works as a senior programs manager at People Demand Change organization in Washington. From the time he left the camp, he has been in almost daily contact with friends and colleagues in Yarmouk. Nidal Bitari.
Hello, everybody. Actually, when it comes to introducing myself, recently I started feeling like I'm...
You're going to have to be much louder.
Okay.
Louder and
That won't make you any louder.
Okay.
Just belt it out.
When it comes to introducing myself, recently I started feeling like I'm really confused. Like, am I Syrian or I am Palestinian? Because like saying Syrian Palestinian does not reflect the reality. Like being a Palestinian who was born in Syria maybe is the best to introduce myself. Why I'm saying that? I'm saying that because when I left Syria, I started feeling like I am a Palestinian refugee, like a real Palestinian refugee. It's well known maybe that Palestinians in Syria were having the best social and economic rights among the refugees in the Middle East. But when I left Syria to Lebanon, I started thinking like, okay, now I'm in Lebanon, I cannot like be legal here for more than 15 days, and then I have to find another way to legalize my status in Lebanon, and I cannot leave to Jordan because I'm not allowed to go to Jordan, and I want a visa to go, for example, to Turkey, and it's very hard to get a visa to go to Turkey. So I started feeling like what is the meaning of being Palestinian refugee, that he is really sieged. I left behind me my people in Syria living under siege in the camps. One of them was Yarmouk camp. Now Yarmouk camp is almost done. ISIS is controlling the camp and fighting with Jabhat al-Nusra, and other camps were destroyed out of like 12 camps for Palestinian refugees in Syria. And it was really shocking that as far as I remember, last year in 2015, maybe in April 2015, the Security Council held a special session for Yarmouk camp when ISIS invaded the camp. And the camp is only 2 kilometers square. And all the international community could not find a solution for 2 kilometers in Syria. So I started thinking how this international community will really find a solution for the war in Syria, which was already getting complicated more and more since it was started as an armed conflict in 2012. It was really shocking how all the uprising in the Middle East started as peaceful movement, but none of us, maybe including me, remember one of these movements or a name of one of non-violence movements inside, for example, inside Syria. But we all now know, and like Jabhat Nusra and ISIS and other radical and Islamic groups. But this does not mean that there are no anti-war and non-violence movements in the region. No, there is, and there is a lot, and they are trying to reach out the international community, but they don't have a voice or a sound supported voice that can make you and me like hear their perspective. And maybe because all these groups who were already exist before the war in Syria and even in general in the Middle East, they were living under dictatorships. They were not allowed to present themselves as they supposed to be. And one of these movements, like the left wing of this movement, which was shocking, how most of these movements were anti-revolution in most of the Arab world. And for me, as a Palestinian who was raised in a camp in Syria, I was shocked mainly by the Palestinian left movements who are until now supporting al-Assad regime, and even they are not supporting the rights of their own people, as me, as a Palestinian, for example. All these left movements turned into militias. In reality, they went out of their political and political parties cover, and mainly inside Syria, they established militias fighting with the Syrian regime against civilians. Actually, this division and the left movement in the Arab world is not only inside Syria. It was over all the Arab world. I was very sad when the left leadership, Shukri Bel'aid, was murdered in Tunisia. But this guy was promoting for al-Assad regime. And his movement in Tunisia was also promoting for al-Assad regime. And this is how it started. But it got complicated more and more until the recent situation in Syria, where more than, if you know that all the Syrian population is about 23 million, half of them are either refugees outside Syria and Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan, or internal displaced, and the less percentage of them actually are internal displaced, and the rest are living under the regime's the regime. I mean, the Syrian population now, they are either murdered, killed by the Syrian regime, or the Islamic armed groups, or refugees around the world. And you know the crisis in Europe now. And if I want to be honest with you, maybe I work very close, not to the US administration, but to part of this administration, since I work on Syria and Yemen. I'll be honest with you, even if this will not make you happy, that if the US government today decides to lift its hand from Syria, most of the Syrian people will starve to death. Most of the assistance that is coming for the Syrian people is coming from the US. Most of the human rights organizations who are operating in Syria, I mean in Turkey, or in Lebanon, or in Jordan, are getting funded by the US administration, from the State Department and the USAID. Now we can disagree about the mechanisms of their work, about the implementation, but this is a fact. The US administration is the largest donor for the Syrian refugees and the internally displaced inside Syria. When I meet the US decision makers sometimes and have discussions about Syria, actually it started since I arrived here in 2013, maybe by the end of 2013. It was very clear that the US government does not have a clear idea about what is going inside in Syria. And not only the US government, actually even all the Western governments, when we used to meet the European Union leaderships in Lebanon, you feel that the only lesson that they've learned from Iraq is that to not intervene at all, in neither way, either in as troops on the ground or in a political in the political field. And this is why until now there is no clear vision here in the US and in the EU about how the situation in Syria will end up. And don't forget that China, Russia, earlier in 2013 and 2014 put a lot of vetoes on the resolutions of the Security Council, mainly on the humanitarian assistance, like entering humanitarian assistance to the besieged areas. Even for me and for my colleagues and friends who are Syrians and who are working in the Syrian coalition or the High Commission for negotiations, they have goals that we want to get rid of Assad. We want him out. But believe me, they don't have until now a mechanism or an agenda or a strategy how to get him out. And because of this, they don't have a clear advice for the EU governments and for the US government how to take steps toward changing the regime in Syria into a democratic one. In all this chaos inside Syria and in Yemen and in Libya, and because of the division and because of, to some extent, the disappearance of the civil society organizations in the Middle East, the other voice, I mean the Islamic and the radical Islamic voices started to raise. And because they are well supported, even if this will make Gulf states lovers angry, but because they are supported by Saudi Arabia, because they are supported by Qatar, because they are supported, even if maybe it's not directly by their government, but indirectly under table by some shuyukhs. Sheikh is the figure, the religion figure leader in Islam. Because of this support, ISIS exists now, and Jabhat Nusra exists. And they are taking control over a lot of areas in Syria more and more. For me, as I will not say as a left, like I will say as a secular. Now, really, I have as a secular one. Really, if you ask me now, what is the solution for Syria? How we can get rid of, or what is the priority now? Getting rid of Assad or getting rid of ISIS? Even if they are like coordinating both with each other. And it was very clear, especially in southern Damascus, that the Syrian regime is coordinating with ISIS.
Yep.
They are, like, the Syrian regime is evacuating the injured people of ISIS who are fighting Jabhat Nusra to the hospitals in Damascus, treating them and then pushing them back into the battlefield. And even more, the Syrian regime, maybe 2 months ago, evacuated about 12 Iraqi and foreign fighters from southern Damascus, which is completely besieged area, from Al Yarmouk camp to Al-Raqqa, the capital of ISIS, and now these 12 are sitting in Mosul in Iraq. I mean, the Syrian regime is really supporting ISIS, but in what way, I really don't know. Is, like, if I want to say that the Syrian regime, like, created ISIS, I feel like I'm exaggerating. No, it's not true. But there is a coordination. Yeah.
No, you got 1 minute.
Okay. Actually, you cannot stop when you start talking about Syria and this chaos. But really, this chaos is leading us to a question. What is the future of the nonviolence movement in the Middle East? How we can support them? How we can make their voices heard here in the US, United Nations, and the EU. Thank you so much.